Yeah, we do butterfly species from time to time. Try to cover the life history of one species and give a little more insight into what they look like. And the species account for tonight is Follosaur catalyst. This is the common Sottywing, and this is a tiny little butterfly, a type of skipper which lives down in the very most harsh type of scrubby habitat down on the shrub steppe. Lives in very hot areas in the Columbia Basin mostly. It has a very unique egg. There's no other butterfly species in Washington that has an egg that looks at all like this. Very intricate little thing. These little red eggs. These are tiny. They're only about 0.6 of a millimeter in diameter, so they're about the same size as some of our smallest blues. First instar is kind of typical skipper instar. It's got the, where's my arrow here? It's got the orange body and the bifurcated black head. It also has the black neck band that's so typical of skipper larvae. And you might notice that there's little tips. Each of these little hairs or setae has a little tip on the top, kind of a little cross tip, which is kind of neat. And as they grow larger, this is the second instar, we're up to 4.5 millimeters now, and it turns green, of course, and the color becomes much more evident. This big black collar that's, again, very typical of skippers, and the black head. The patterns on the faces of the heads actually are pretty diagnostic for skippers, and we often try to photograph the skipper heads because that's an identification method. Anybody have any ideas what all this white stuff is? Oh.
Could it be white? I was like, sure.
I was going to say it was pepper. The plants that these grow on are a type of plant in the family called Chenopodium. And for those who know a little bit of Latin or Greek, Cheno means goose and podium means foot. And they're called goosefoots, and I'll show you why a little bit later. But they tend to have a lot of salt on the leaves. And if you put the leaf on your tongue, it's very salty. Kind of cool. Here's the next larger instar. This is the fourth instar. Again, the very well-defined black collar here. You see there's a lot of fine little white sepia or hairs on the head. The body is developing, because it's green, and developing a lot of white spots. And those white spots, of course, blend right in with the white salt spots on the leaves. Nice little bit of camouflage there. And the final instar gets to be quite large. This is 19 millimeters. Again, this is a real small skipper. And 19 millimeters, that's a big larva. That's, you know, more than 3/4 of an inch. That's a pretty large larva for such a small butterfly. But very typical of skippers. When skippers have large larvae, and then as a larvae pupate, that last stage, they drop down to about half the size as when they were larvae. They just suddenly get much smaller. Here is the pupa, and again, this one's 14 millimeters, so it's still pretty big. But this is going to hatch into a very small butterfly. If you had a pupa this size in some other butterfly family, the butterfly that would come out of it would be quite a bit larger. This is the head. Oops. This is the head end of the pupa. They have what I call a baby seal face. They've got the two little eyes and the whiskers and so on. Kind of cute. And again, the patterns on the pupa heads are fairly distinctive too, so you can use those also to identify them. Here again is the adult. Now the adults range from a kind of a rich chestnut brown like this to sometimes they look almost black. And the pattern of white spots on the wings is very distinctive. Like all skippers, they have the recurved antennae. That's an easy way to always tell skippers, by the tip of the antennae. And this is the plant that they occur on, Chenopodium album. They actually use quite a few different kinds of plants, but most of them are in the goosefoot family. And here's why they call them goosefoots. The leaves look like the footprint of a goose. See, there's 3 toes, the outer toe and the webbing and so on. So that's why they call them goosefoots.
Do you know if they're mostly using the herbaceous members of the family, or if they use the shrubby members too?
I don't really know. This is the only plant I've actually found them on. So I'm not that familiar with all of the species, but they do use a lot of weedy species and some native species, but typically stuff that you see in these real scrubby, dry desert areas. That's it. Does anyone have any questions? Rich?
The large weight loss between the larval and the adult stage, does it reflect much more activity in the pupal stage or any heat generation or anything?
There is a big weight loss. I mean, you had a 19 millimeter larva. It's a big larva for that little thing, and the weight of the adult butterfly, I would say, is less than half of that by the time it gets done. And just where all that weight goes, I'm not sure. Probably part of it is water. You know, it just doesn't form into cell material. But again, that's pretty typical of skippers. They have large larvae and usually a much smaller pupa, and then the skipper is surprisingly small for the size of the immature stages. Richard?
Where do you see them in the state and when?
One of the best places, many of you have been to Spokane Canyon over by Wenatchee. This is just, I don't know, 5 miles north of Wenatchee on the west side of the Columbia River. There's a canyon called Spokane Canyon. Right in the mouth of that canyon, just the very, very first part, down on the private land, right alongside the road, you find a lot of these goosefoots. And sometimes you find quite a few of the eggs. The eggs are very difficult to see. It looks like a little red egg would show up really well on this leaf, but boy, they are hard to find. They're on the underside, and they usually lay them on the vein, and the veins are kind of red, and the egg's red. And you can look and look and look. I looked for a long time, and I finally found one, and oh, that's what they look like, and then I found them all over. And the larvae feed on the leaves, and they roll the leaves over, so they make a nest in the leaf. The larvae are easy to find because there's a nice little rolled leaf up on the top of the plant.
So is east slope of the Cascades kind of typical for them?
Yeah, well east of the crest. They're down in the lowlands.
And what season would you find them?
They're multiple brooded, and so you find them fairly early in the spring, and you find subsequent broods later in the summer. Someone else have a question?
I did that.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
That was my question too.
Oh, okay. What else? I think that's about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dave.